Welcome back to I'm Bored, Why the Hell Not? Episode 9, the Big Steps edition. Nate Bukaty from 810 WHB does a great job with his charity walk and run, the Big Steps. Go check it out, and if you can, sign up for the walk or run or make a donation to a great cause fighting cancer. Let's talk about some of the big items going on in Kansas City sports, starting with what's going on in the media of late. KU going to 810. It was announced yesterday by Sports Radio, or 610 Sports Radio, that KU would no longer be on their station. And then today, followed up, 810 announced that the KU football and basketball games would be on 810. It's an interesting switch for 810 and in some ways for 610. Up until this point, over the course of really their existence, but at least in the last decade, the 610 Sports Radio's philosophy has been basically to pay for properties like the Royals and like KU, and pay a little bit less for talent. 810, on the other hand, they've had their property with K-State, but for the and somewhat in agreement with the Chiefs, but they don't broadcast the games. Instead, they've invested more in talent and a little bit less in properties. Well, this shows a little bit of a switch because they have less talent than they used to, including myself and TJ Carpenter, but now they're spending more on properties. So while there wasn't enough budget maybe to keep a couple of people on staff, they do have enough budget to go out and woo KU away from 610 Sports. We'll see how that works out for them in the long run. It'll also be interesting to see how 810 handles this. A lot of the ways you make money on these type of properties is with pre- and post-game shows. It's not something you really heard much about K-State. There was no real K-State pre- or post-game show hosted by 810 that was on the air during football or basketball season. A little bit of College Game Day during football, but clearly no dedicated pre- and post-game to football or basketball for K-State. I'm assuming that'll change with KU. And, as we mentioned, they have a little less staff. It'll be interesting to see how they staff what's going on with the KU pre- and post-game shows now that they're going to be on Sports Radio 810. Speaking of less talent, Soren Petro showed a little frustration earlier today when they were doing their live press conferences from St. Joe and Chiefs training camp. The audio quality wasn't very good, and Soren sometimes gets a little caught up with his frustrations and takes those to the air, and he made it well known on Twitter and on the air today that he was a little frustrated with the fact that the press conferences didn't sound very good. If you are going to broadcast the press conferences, as both stations do, especially from Chiefs training camp, you have to make sure that sound quality is high, and it was not that today on Sports Radio 810. Could it maybe go back again to a lack of as much talent? TJ Carpenter used to spend pretty much the entire training camp for Sports Radio 810 covering the Chiefs when he was here. He's no longer here. It also reminds me of something that Kevin Keatsman talked about with Eric Berry and his leaving or not attending OTAs, something that's come up again here of late with the tweets of Tom Bahali. But Keatsman made the point at the time that as a leader and someone who should want to make the team better, Berry should have made sure he was at OTAs. Well, clearly we understand that 810 had a little problem with their broadcast today from Chiefs training camp. So might I suggest that as a leader and someone who would want to make his station better, maybe Keatsman should volunteer to cover training camp a little more often. He can go to the morning pressers and still make it back to Kansas City in time for his 2 o'clock show. Let's keep track and see if he volunteers to go make his team better as one of the leaders, as he suggested Eric Berry should do. In some other media news of this week, we mentioned Tom Bahali and the tweets he sent out about his teammates and about his playing time. It caused Bob Fescoe and him to get in a little bit of a Twitter spat. In fact, Twitter spats have been a little bit common for Fescoe over the past week. He also got into this little one with Randy Jazzerli, who, of course, appears on Sports Radio 810, and he's even gotten into it a little bit more often lately with the listeners. Generally, when you see Fescoe firing out against people, trying to get a little more attention on Twitter, it's a lot of times because the ratings aren't so good. Radio ratings come out after January, February, March. That's book 1. April, May, June is book 2. It usually takes 4 to 6 weeks for those ratings to come out, maybe a little bit less, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks for those ratings to come out with the new system. And what do we know? We're here in late July, so the June book probably just hit the shelves. So does that mean ratings aren't so good at 610? Draw conclusions where you want, but I always find it's interesting to see when hosts are trying to get a little extra attention right around the time that the book comes out. Finally, the Royals make a big trade this week, getting Trevor Cahill, Buchter, I forget his first name right off the top of my head, my apologies, and Brandon Maurer. I think it's a great move by the Royals. I was a big one that said sell early when they didn't look like they were going to get back into the race, but they've gotten back to the race, and so I think it's a good move that they bought. Because I think in baseball, you buy or you sell. Standing pat hardly ever gets you anywhere. So I think a good move by the Royals to make this move. I think Trevor Cahill will be an important part of this, maybe the most important part of this trade, at least getting the Royals into the postseason. But then if they do get there, Brandon Maurer may become the most important part of this trade as he's able to, again, shorten the game and help out the Royals bullpen, which has sputtered at times this year, although it is showing a lot more promise as of late. Make no mistake, though, this trade not as big as the one that brought Johnny Cueto. None of the three guys they got back from the San Diego Padres will be able to make the impact Johnny Cueto did for the Royals in their World Series run. That's episode 9 of I'm Bored, Why the Hell Not?